My fellow Americans, welcome to The Celluloid President, the podcast about American presidents on film. Today we're discussing Elvis and Nixon, the 2016 comedy drama about the day Elvis Presley met Richard Nixon in the White House.
Of all the famous images preserved in our national archives, the most requested photo of all time is this one.
You remember when you talked about finding an ally for Nixon?
Someone from the outside.
I need to get this letter to the president.
You'll never guess in a million years who just showed up at the Northwest Gate asking to see him.
It's Elvis. Elvis Presley. You swear this isn't a joke, because this penmanship is horrible. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I'm Gary Holmes, and joining me today via Zoom from California is Jim Robinson. Jim, if you could have a federal at-large badge, which agency would you want to get it from?
Well, that's an easy one, Gary. The IRS. Wouldn't it be kind of fun to see everyone quake in fear whenever they approached you?
I'm sure you'd get a lot of very interesting talk at parties.
Well, the other thing is, the other good thing about it is, if I had one, I imagine there'd be some kind of computer accident within the IRS, and my file would be permanently deleted from the records.
Well, you're more creative than I am. I was thinking that I'd like to be a special agent at the AFT. That, of course, is the Bureau of Alcohol, Firearms, and Tobacco. And I think there's a crying need for a special undercover investigation of California wineries to see if their claims to produce wine that's as good as French wine is actually true. So that's probably long investigation into that.
That is pretty smart, but I'll still go with the IRS.
Okay. All right. Before we get to the nuts and bolts of the movie, we have a few corrections and clarifications to make. In our Forrest Gump episode last time, I said that the special effects in the movie Zelig were performed using a blue screen. In fact, the correct technology was a green screen. I regret the error.
Well, I'm glad you regretted it, Gary, because that's just inexcusable. I mean, I knew when you said that it couldn't have been a blue screen. Yeah, well, I mean, it's just a critical, terrible error.
Okay. Also last week, Jim and I had a discussion about a movie trailer for Forrest Gump 2, starring Tom Hanks and Timothée Chalamet. There is, in fact, a Forrest Gump 2 trailer, but it's a fake. Apparently, there's a small cottage industry making fake movie trailers using AI and existing film stock. This is Hollywood's worst nightmare because it shows you can take an actor's image and turn it into anything. Forrest Gump 2 trailer is so realistic that I would have believed it was real, except that I had done the research that said there would never be a sequel, and I had to Google all over the place to see if it was real, and it was not. So,
well, I'll take ownership for that one because I'm the one that brought it up and was sure that it was real.
No, I went. Yeah.
I saw not only one very slickly produced Forrest Gump 2 trailer, but I saw two of them. And one of them had over 1 million views.
I know.
And I have a feeling that what these inventive people are doing is they think they're kind of auditioning for studios, but they don't realize that they're probably screwing themselves out of jobs forever.
Well, I think that's exactly right. I think they want to show how creative they can be and how they can use AI and
get noticed.
But if you start looking for these trailers, they're all over the place. There's a particular one that's the most famous one, involves James Bond. We need to get James Bond into every podcast. So that's
good. I'm glad you did it because I would be at a loss for this one. But
okay. Also, last episode, I mentioned the movie Here, starring Tom Hanks and Robin Wright, as directed by Robert Zemeckis. As I predicted, and this is not a mistake, actually. This was me being correct. It turned out to be a complete bomb. In fact, Tom Hanks hasn't had a successful role since 2019 when he played Mr. Rogers in A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. And perhaps his low point was portraying Colonel Tom Parker in the 2022 movie Elvis, which is today's discussion.
Yeah, but that movie was a big success. I didn't see it. Was his role bad or embarrassing?
It was really embarrassing. It was horrible. Okay. I mean, he had this really bizarre. First of all, they put him in a huge fat suit, and because that's how Tom Parker looked. And they also he had a terrible, terrible Southern accent. It was really bad. You should look at the trailer or something and see.
Yeah.
I mean, he's not on a hot streak at all. And like unlike Tom Cruise, who's got, hit after hit, the other Tom. All right. So this is our eighth episode featuring or about Richard Nixon. And I don't think we've got anything new to say about him at this point, but you and I have never talked about Elvis on the podcast or in real life. We were both born just before the release of Elvis's first hit single, That's All Right. What is your relationship to him? Again, we've never talked about this, so I'm curious.
Yeah, not much. For some reason, I never became a fan. I never disliked him, but I never really got into him. And he never figured in my upbringing like the Beatles. Of course, we were a little young to be aware when he first burst on the scene. My hunch is it could be kind of a class thing because my parents, may they rest in peace, were kind of middle class aspirational.
Yeah.
To be, upward looking culturally. There is middle class snobbery, and I wouldn't go so far as to call my dear mom and dad snobs. But the one genre of music my father actively disliked was country music. And Elvis had, of course, roots in country. And so it just never entered our household. How about you?
No, it's exactly the same thing. It wasn't my parents did not have Elvis records around, but then they were kind of too old. They weren't teenagers during the rock and roll era, the first rock and roll era, and I, of course, you and I weren't born, or were only, we were 6 years old, I think, when he went into the army, and when Buddy Holly died. So rock and roll had kind of that first wave of rock and roll was all over when we were 10 years old. As we've talked about, like on the Beatles podcast, it was pop music that was taking over. And also, this is the time when Elvis was making mediocre movies as a money grab. So he by then he'd lost his reputation for being cutting edge. I thought of him as a relic of the past, even though it had only been 10 years earlier when he'd been a huge star.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the movies because I was going to say that's one of the things, probably my main exposure was to some of those movies. As you know, I kind of like those 1960s set pieces and movies. And, I love Viva Las Vegas and Blue Hawaii and those kinds of things. That's mainly what I remember Elvis as being all about. John Lennon was always quick with a quip and said at one point, I think in the early 70s, that Elvis died when he went into the army.
Yeah.
And what John was talking about was what you were saying about sort of the demise of the first wave of cutting edge rock and roll.
Yeah, I mean, and when we were teenagers, the only song I can remember hitting the top 40 is In the Ghetto.
Yeah, I remember that one.
Which, had this very earnest message. It would almost seem like a parody. So basically, like you, I had no relationship with Elvis, and I really couldn't understand the appeal because I wasn't young when he was young, and as far as I was concerned, he was as dated as Bing Crosby.
Yeah, and there could be another thing at work because if you recall, when we were in high school and in college, singer-songwriters were the thing.
Yeah.
Especially, the solo artists like Joni Mitchell. And part of the appeal, I think, to sort of inward-looking, narcissistic college kids like us was that the singers wrote their own songs, that they were exposing a part of their own being to us. Elvis didn't write his songs. So I think there was just sort of an imperviousness to his appeal for, self-absorbed teens and college kids like us.
Have you ever been to Graceland?
No, I haven't. Have you?
Yeah, we went to. It's definitely worth going to Memphis because Graceland is there, and Sun Studios, and also the Civil Rights Museum where Martin Luther King was shot. But we did go, and it's not as big as you'd expect. Graceland looks big because it's in a neighborhood of much smaller homes. And you go inside and it's got all these great 1970s furnishings, which look kind of super tacky today. I mean, it's like
it was the 70s.
It was the 70s, and everything in the 70s was tacky, including our hair.
Right, and neckties.
and neckties, yeah. And I still, I gotta say, I literally, I've tried. I don't get it really. I don't really like his music that much, and it's. I know it's my loss, but I just don't relate to the whole Elvis fascination in a way that I'm sure other people can't relate to our Beatles fascination.
Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about the movie itself. I think it's your turn to summarize.
Here I go. Elvis
Okay.
and Nixon, as you said, a 2016 comedy drama starring Kevin Spacey as Richard Nixon and Michael Shannon as Elvis Presley. It's rated R, probably only due to several fleeting F-bombs here and there,
Yeah.
including the very first line that Richard Nixon speaks right off the bat before the opening credits. It tells the humorous and bizarre story of how the December 21, 1970 Oval Office meeting between the two came about. Seems that Elvis was concerned about the drug problem in the United States and wanted to offer his services to the president, not only as a positive influencer over youth, but he also wanted to be named a special agent at large for the Drug Enforcement Agency, complete with a badge to make it official. If that wasn't enough, he wanted to do undercover work for the government, which would have been really interesting given the fact that his face was one of the most famous anywhere on the planet. So after getting this idea, Elvis just flies into Washington with his factotum Jerry Schilling and proceeds to the front gate of the White House to deliver his handwritten note requesting a meeting. He's also packing his usual couple of concealed weapons, which creates several humorous scenes throughout the movie. Inside the White House, two young and politically savvy aides see the political value for their boss in meeting Elvis. So they convince the highly resistant Nixon and the tyrannical chief of staff, Bob Haldeman, to go along. Along the way, we see some very interesting interactions and bonding between the square, clean-cut Nixon aides and Elvis and his cool, hip entertainment aides. The film climaxes with the Oval Office meeting, which is awkward, funny, touching, and moving all at the same time. Two men from different worlds who rose from nothing to fantastic heights of global fame and impact. That's an irresistible subject for movies, books, and historians, which is why we are still talking about this meeting with fascination 55 years later.
Okay, excellent. Excellent. I have nothing to add, except I'll add that the movie was produced by Bleecker Street, which is a small independent studio, and Amazon Studios, which is not a small independent studio. In 2016 and continuing for several years, Amazon wanted to build content on its Prime streaming service, so it worked with a number of small studios to build its library. And as a result, the movie did not get the usual rollout that a major theatrical release would have gotten. It ended up with a worldwide grosses of 1.8 million, which is a pittance. And then it went on to live on Amazon Prime site, where you can watch it today for free if you're an Amazon Prime subscriber. Jim, had you ever heard of this movie before we started digging around for movies to watch?
No, but of course, being a Nixonologist, I knew about the meeting. And in fact, there was a previous movie about this meeting called Elvis Meets Nixon in 1997, produced with a bunch of Canadian actors mainly and distributed by Showtime. I've never seen that one. Have you?
Yeah. No. And in fact, I've never heard of that one either. And I had never heard of this movie before we started poking around looking for movies about presidents. All right. So who would you recommend this movie to?
Well, I think anyone who likes Elvis, who likes or is interested in Nixon, or both, and who enjoy the anecdotes and folklore of presidential and White House history. And I would add those who appreciate Kevin Spacey, as I do, who, despite his run-ins with the law and Me Tooism, he's always interesting to watch on the screen, in my opinion.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. I think anyone who's a fan of Nixon or Elvis would get a big kick out of it. I would not recommend it to people who are offended by blue talk or swearing in general. I mean, Nixon's mouth is pretty potty. If you're uncomfortable with that, you'll have to skip it.
I also think that those who might be interested, this is one of the reasons I was interested, is to see the staff dynamics that are in play when you've got a famous or powerful figure and how the dedicated, loyal staff slavishly try to cater to their every whim. And I think it's just interesting to see that dynamic and to see how the factotums for both figures interacted with each other. And we, you and I have sort of been in staff positions like that. So I think people would be interested in that if they have had similar jobs.
Yeah, well, that sort of leads to the next question is what you liked about the movie. You've already begun to discuss that. What else did you like about the movie?
Yeah, I did like that interaction, but I like the sense of fun of the movie. Portraying a bizarre meeting between two famous people. It's not terribly an ambitious film. It's not preachy. It's not really political. It's just taking an intriguing bit of presidential folklore and milking it for all it's worth.
Yeah, I
So
agree.
that,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, it's a tight story. It's only
yeah,
86 minutes long. Yeah, it's alternately funny, jaw-dropping, ridiculous, and serious when it needs to be. There's not a lot of fat, and your interest doesn't flag. So yes, I agree with that. What
and
else?
there's some nostalgia value. I
Hmm.
mean, it opens
Yep.
with good scenes and music from the late '60s, early '70s. Interestingly, with images of the real Nixon and the real Elvis. And so, while the early '70s were not quite as they were grungier and more depressing than, say, some of the excitement of the counter '60s and the brilliant colors of the mid '60s. It was still nostalgic for people of our age, for boomers. And I
Yeah,
like that as well.
yeah, I was going to say almost exactly the same thing. I thought it does a great job of recreating 1970 Washington, D.C. And in a way, because it's painting on a smaller canvas, it does a better job of recreating that period than the more epic, big budget pictures.
Yes.
The hippie era is very hard to get right because the clothes were so bizarre that even if the costumes and set design are 100% right, they just don't seem to be. And related to that, I noticed the different style choices between Elvis and his entourage and the Nixon aides. The aides, the Elvis aides and the Nixon aides are probably pretty close in age, but the Elvis guys have long hair and sideburns, and the Nixon guys are painfully clean cut. So this is 1970, which is really,
That's how things were.
yeah, that's the
The
tipping point.
divide.
It's
Yeah.
the tipping point between when long hair was considered a political statement and when it was a fashion choice. Those Nixon aides are not hippies at all, but they've co-opted the look. And just 10 years later, 1980, that long hair would have been the hairstyle of choice for some of the most conservative elements of society.
Yeah, I agree with that. I thought, as I kind of mentioned, the comparison and
Yeah.
contrast between Jerry and Sonny on Elvis's side and Dwight and Bud Krogh on the Nixon side, I thought was really, really interesting. And there were commonalities in addition to differences.
You mentioned Dwight and Bud, and for those Nixon fans who of a certain age, that is Dwight Chapin and Bud Crow, who are hugely famous, who got caught up later in Watergate, unfortunately.
Right.
Anything else?
Not for likes.
Well, I particularly like the character of Jerry Schiller, Elvis's friend and fixer. And as you just mentioned, you and I can relate to that because we're not famous, but we've tried to help famous people get through the day. And this guy has a lot of serenity and common sense. He's very smooth. And not surprisingly, he went on to manage the Beach Boys, Jerry Lee Lewis, Billy Joel, and Lisa Marie Presley. So I thought his characterization was particularly good.
Yeah, and I thought we'll get to the acting. I thought the actor did a
Yeah.
very good job too. But that does bring me a little bit to my dislikes.
Okay.
And that is, I thought the Jerry Schilling and his would-be fiance subplot was felt a little forced.
Right.
And it wasn't terrible, but it felt like padding. And you can understand why they had to pad this movie because, there's only so much you could act out about the meeting. And I'd say the same with Elvis's visit to the Black Donut Shop. These are sort of peripheral kinds of scenes that I thought, oh, okay, fair enough, but didn't really
Well, it's
grab me.
padding. I mean, I think, well, the difference between those two scenes is that the donut shop actually happened. I mean,
Okay.
that's not fictional. The thing with Schiller and his girlfriend, that's all made up for padding and for plot purposes.
Yeah. Well, the movie did sort of have a cheap feel to it. But despite the direction, I thought, being pretty good. And lastly, I'd say, as one who was, as we've confessed, we're not really that into Elvis. It didn't really tell us much about Elvis's career, his trajectory, his views. It didn't delve much into his politics, other than he got caught up in this sort of paranoia about crime and drugs, genuine concerns. Um, so I thought it let the audience down a little bit in terms of exposing a little more about Elvis and where he was at his career in that time.
I mean, that's not what the movie was about,
Right.
and I think the movie does presuppose that we all know that Elvis is one of the most famous people in the world, and that Nixon is one of the most famous people in the world, and we bring that knowledge to the movie, so I'm okay with that. I got very little to complain about, but I'll say that Nixon's self-pitying in these movies is getting to be a bit tiresome and kind of hackneyed.
Yeah.
And I know it was a real thing, but I don't think we've watched a Nixon movie where he doesn't bitch about JFK and about how he had everything handed to him on a silver platter. I mean, do we have to hear that over and over again?
Yeah, but I was saving this for scenes because it was actually one of my favorite, because I saw it as parody. I thought the
I know,
idea
I
that
know.
Kevin Spacey, the idea that as Elvis was about to come into a meeting, suddenly that the Nixon got triggered improbably to go into another self-pitying about how good Elvis had and how tough Nixon had, especially given Elvis's
I
background.
know
So
Elvis's background was much tougher than Nixon's.
yeah, I actually saw that as them making fun of that, but you
Yeah,
know,
I know. Yeah, maybe. It's hard to tell whether they're making fun of it or considering that on a keen insight. Uh,
right.
this is not a complaint per se, but I think it's glaring that there's no Elvis music in this movie.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And the same thing happened in the Elvis movie that I was just talking about. You only hear like 15 seconds of a song. Obviously, the Elvis estate is holding on to those music rights very tightly.
Yeah, I noticed that because they had some really great music in this movie.
Yeah,
From the 60s, Creedence Clearwater and all that,
yeah.
but
Blood,
no
sweat, and tears.
Elvis music. Yeah,
Yeah,
so I'm assuming that it was rights
yeah,
issues.
yeah.
You
They
know,
either didn't want to pay or well, they couldn't have afforded. This has a low budget movie, so they probably couldn't have paid. But
it
it's
would
gonna,
have
it's gonna
really
make.
helped the movie.
And yeah, another thing I didn't really like the end notes at the end where they say what happened to everybody. Especially when they say that Bud Crow and Dwight Chapin were convicted of Watergate crimes and that Nixon resigned. I mean, it just seemed gratuitous and snarky, especially since we just seen those guys as, basically two good guys.
Yeah, and then refresh my memory if you remember. Did they talk about Elvis's cause of death? I don't think so in the end notes,
No, they did not.
because it's terribly ironic
Well, the whole
since it
thing
was
about,
drugs.
right, he died of drugs, of course,
No,
but
they
legal
were
drugs.
abusive, yeah, abusive prescription drugs. I think one of his doctors went to prison.
Yeah,
But
like Michael Jackson's doctor.
yeah,
Yes, it is ironic that he comes in and complains about drug abuse, but again, he keeps telling everyone, "I only use legal drugs." What do you think the movie's trying to accomplish?
well, we touched on it on a fundamental level. I think it just wanted to act out how an interesting presidential anecdote came about, and without huge ambitions, just tell the story about the interaction between two very famous people who are an endless source of interest, Nixon and Elvis, and trying to show some of the intersections between entertainment and politics, the similarities and the differences between the two worlds, and also what it's like to be the slavish staffers in both fields.
Yeah, and I would also say very closely related to that, that that picture of Nixon and Elvis is supposedly the most requested photo from the National Archives, and
Hmm.
it appears on merchandise everywhere. In fact, when we went to the Nixon Library, I'm sure we saw it all over the place there.
Yeah.
One Christmas, my wife gave me a pad of notepaper that had this image on it, for example. So this movie capitalizes on that fascination. And another important sub theme of the movie, and this is kind of trite, but is that people are people. These two guys are two of the most famous people in the world, although their worlds barely overlapped. And they both turned out to be very human, who managed to drop their masks and show their vulnerabilities. And somewhat related to that, it's a bit interesting that when you're famous, you don't really know that much about other famous people. And I think this is because to become famous, you have to have a single-minded focus in your own area. In the movie, Nixon knows who Elvis is, but knows very little about him. And Elvis, of course, knows nothing about how the government works.
Yeah, it was hilarious when Nixon grumpily said, "Well, get me his bio. I have to prepare for this meeting." Everything had to be staffed out to the most minute detail.
All right. I mean, why do you think that movie so, why do you think that photograph is so famous?
I, you know, I think because it's counterintuitive,
Right.
even though it probably shouldn't be, because Elvis was not a wild-eyed liberal entertainer. I don't think he was an activist on the conservative side, but you know, he, but it just seemed to be Nixon was viewed as so square and so traditional. And Elvis was viewed as a cool cat, if a little bit over the hill by then. I just think it was seen as a clash, a gee whiz clash of two worlds, overstated in my view. Why
Well,
do you think it is?
I think you're right because it's just so weird and unexpected because those two, both of those guys were then at kind of a weird stage, right? And
Yes.
them to be seen together. I mean, Elvis was obviously starting to get a little deranged, and Nixon was not kind of kooky yet, but by the time he kind of became kooky, and so I think that's why. Well, let's talk about the actors. You already mentioned Kevin
Mhm.
Spacey. What do you think of his act?
Well, I thought he was, the look, he didn't have much of the look, but
Yeah,
I thought his voice was quite good, a good
yeah,
imitation, and the posture. He's just always interesting to look at. I think he's an excellent actor and hard to take your eyes off him on the screen, no matter what he's in.
yeah. It's kind of hard to react to him now like we would have in 2016 because, as you mentioned, since then he's been accused of sexually assaulting quite a few teenage boys. Um, it's like when you see Alec Baldwin on the screen now, you can't help but remember that he literally shot a guy.
Yeah,
I think he's very good, though. I think he's one of the better Nixons. He gets at his Nixon's essential squareness, but also his insecurities. And then, as you said, the voice and mannerisms are very good.
yeah, yeah. What about Michael Shannon as Elvis?
I don't know this actor at all. I don't think he went on to do anything else. I don't think he has Elvis's animal magnetism or sensuality. It's hard to understand in the world of the movie why people are falling all over this guy. I mean, he just isn't, he's not, I don't
Yeah, I
really has it
I
for
thought
me.
he was. I think from what I read about him, he's he plays bizarre, quirky kinds of characters.
Yeah.
I thought he was pretty good. His face was too angular; it wasn't puffy enough, and his voice wasn't deep enough. As you say, maybe that's part of the animal magnetism. But just by virtue of the fact that there's so many Elvis impersonators in the world, it
Yeah.
doesn't take a hell of a lot, especially for someone like me who has not examined every photo and every movement and every mannerism of Elvis like I have with all the Beatles. It doesn't take much for me to get some believability there. And when he put on the aviator glasses and boofed up the hairdo and wore those outfits, I thought he did a good acting job on it.
Okay. There's not a lot of stars in this movie. Colin Hanks plays Bud Crow. He's the son of Tom Hanks. To me, he seems like a bit of a lightweight in the movie. Bud Crow ran the government's drug policy during the Nixon administration, so he really was not a lightweight. But
Right.
I
And
mean,
Bud Krogh was, then he was put in charge of the White House plumbers.
yeah,
And he was the one who approved the Ellsberg break-in of Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office. So he really went down a sort of a wrong path and realized it and owned up to it pretty quickly compared to some of the others. He approached the prosecutors to confess and didn't even seek a deal or leniency or anything. Ended up serving 4.5 months in prison and passed away in 2020. So he's no longer with us. But an interesting and seemingly conscientious character despite his mistakes. But he was in charge of the meeting in
yeah,
this movie
yeah.
and in reality.
Alex Pettyfer plays Jerry Schilling.
Yeah, I thought he did well. I mean, I don't know much about the actor, but he carried a lot of the movie, as you mentioned. He had a major role,
Yeah, I mean,
and I
he's
thought he did a
actually,
good job.
yeah, he's the most sympathetic figure in the movie. I don't know him from before. I did my IMDb research and found out that he was a child actor and then a grown-up model.
Hmm.
Played the character Alex Rider, who's the main character in a series of British young adult books. In the movie, he plays someone you'd want for your own friend, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
And of course, he was the producer of the movie, so it's no
No
surprise that he's
wonder
also the
why.
most attractive figure. Yeah.
Well, as you sent you called my attention. We'll talk about this even more when we go to history, to a program at the National Archives
Right.
um, that had the real Jerry. Is it Schilling or Schiller? I think it's Schilling.
Schilling?
That whatever.
Schilling, yeah.
Yeah, um, and the real Bud Krogh
Yeah.
doing a discussion together. You could see there this guy Jerry belongs in front of the camera as much as behind the camera. He's got a shtick, he's got a smoothness, he's got an entertainment quality to him. So I think a lot of that came through in the film, the way his role was portrayed.
Yeah. I mean, you can tell those are two good guys. I mean, now they're older and their hairstyles are coming more, closer to each other. And
Yeah,
they're guys who obviously had a great deal of respect for each other, and the repertoire between the two of them was great. And in this video clip that from the National Archives. So yeah, we'll talk about that. I mean, do you have anything else you want to say about any actors before we go
well,
to
yeah,
the...
I want to mention Evan Peters, who played Dwight Chapin, mainly because I wanted to spend a moment on Dwight Chapin.
Okay.
Um, I had a chance about 8, 10 years ago. I had a long meeting with Dwight Chapin, who was obviously much older than he was in this movie. And Evan Peters really nails a
Oh
lot
yeah.
of the look. Of course, the look add 40 years, but
Yeah.
the look and the mannerisms
Okay.
of Dwight Chapin. Um, the circumstance was that he was pitching my organization for some kind of a project. He was doing some freelance, public relations, strategic communications. Very nice guy, very humble guy, and we wanted to help him out a little bit. So I really enjoyed meeting him and then comparing it, however distant in time, to the movie portrayal. And I think they had that done pretty well. Chapin ended up being convicted of perjury and served 9 months in prison after the Watergate period. The other notable thing about him is he, along with Bob Haldeman and one or two others, were avid home movie makers. And there is a movie called Our Nixon
Okay.
that came out in, I want to say, 2013 or something like that. It's about an hour and a half of home movies contributed mainly by Dwight Chapin during the Nixon White House years and the campaign. And it's on Amazon Prime. If anyone wants to see a more let their hair down, which sounds funny with the Nixon crowd, a more informal let their hair down set of moments and episodes, in the Nixon White House, including Dwight Chapin, who was in this movie. I really recommend give that a look. It's very interesting.
Okay, I've never heard of that. We'll have to check it
Yeah.
out. All right. Well, let's turn to the history. How
Okay.
accurate?
Well, thanks to that program you sent, the National Archives discussion between Schilling and Krogh, that made me realize the movie was pretty good on the basic history and basic details of the meeting and how it came about. What they didn't say, and therefore I assume was made up, was that Nixon rejected the meeting at first,
Right.
and also that Julie Nixon got involved and convinced Daddy to go ahead with the meeting, which I don't think that's how the Nixon family worked. And so I assume that was made up as well. Did you catch that? Did you have the same
Yeah,
view?
I caught both those things. This is kind of a slight, not very important movie, but it's fun and interesting, and everyone should watch it. But it's one of the most accurate movies we've seen so far. A lot of what you see on the screen is actually true, including some of the weirdest scenes, like when, as I mentioned, when Elvis goes to the donut shop and shows the black patrons his gun so they won't steal his jewels. Or when he goes to the Drug Enforcement Administration and met this guy, John Finlater, the agency's deputy, and when he tried to get on a plane with a gun, and when he just showed up unannounced at the White House gate to deliver a letter that he'd written on the plane. And also to clarify, I'm surprised it's taken us this long to get to this point. Oh, no, you already mentioned John Lennon once. But Elvis, the Beatles come up in this movie a lot. And Elvis actually did like the Beatles, but claimed he didn't to suck up to Nixon, which was kind of a savvy move.
Yeah, I think I was going to raise as part of this history discussion the whole Beatles and Elvis issue. I think the jury is still a little bit out on exactly what Elvis thought of the Beatles. It's very clear what the Beatles thought of Elvis. They worshiped him, and he was the reason they got into rock and roll. It was Elvis Presley. They did view that he had declined and gone downhill. When they had their famous summit meeting at Elvis's Hillcrest home in the Hollywood Hills, near the beginning of the movie, Elvis blurted out, "If you guys are going to just sit there and stare at me, I'm going to bed." Because they all got in there and they were just in awe. Here you had the four most famous people in the world sitting there dumbfounded in awe of Elvis. But beyond that, there's a lot of murkiness about exactly, what happened at that meeting and also what Elvis thought. And sure, most of any angst could be just chalked up to professional jealousy.
Yeah.
And the fact that Elvis' star was on the decline and the Beatles were still rising. But it's not exactly clear whether Elvis actually loved the Beatles or not. He did cover a few of their songs, though.
Well, I'm sure that Elvis did not love the Beatles, and I'm also sure that he probably had a political gripe with them because he was by this point, more conservative politically than they were, and they were revolutionizing, the world. Now Elvis, of course, had revolutionized the world back in the 50s, but the Beatles were actually more successful because they represented a much bigger generation than Elvis's generation did.
And the Beatles did when the Threedles did their reminiscing for the making of the Beatles anthology movies in the mid-1990s. George, Paul, and Ringo were sitting around a table and discussing Elvis. And they talked a little bit about the meeting back in 1965, and they were making fun of all the stories John had put out about the meeting, how they jammed together and all that. And Paul and George saying, "Yeah, we must have been out of the room when John was jamming with Elvis," and which is what I was getting at. There's a lot of strange stories about that meeting. And then George at one point said, he saw Elvis in Las Vegas, Elvis's Las Vegas show, like in the early 70s. He painted a very sad picture.
Yeah.
Overweight and having all these schlocky female singers in the background for every song. And he said his final line was, "But Elvis was great when he was great."
Yeah.
So a couple little nits on a few nits that I laughed at in the history. they made a deal about how Nixon's thing was to have these M&Ms and this Dr.
Yeah,
Pepper. I'm
yeah,
almost sure that was never a part of Nixon's routine and retinue. Nixon was a very disciplined, fastidious guy. Nixon had a scoop of cottage cheese and a slice of pineapple for lunch every day and a cup of coffee until it was 5 o'clock somewhere in the world. And then the scotch would come out. But I never heard before, and very much doubt, that Nixon insisted on a bottle of Dr. Pepper and M&Ms.
yeah. You're probably right. I didn't pick that up, but I'm sure you're right because, of course, everyone knows about Nixon and his cottage cheese.
Yes, and knows about Reagan and the jelly beans. So I think they were just having some fun there.
Yeah, no. The scene that definitely did not happen was when Crow, Chapin, Schilling, and Sonny West go and meet in a garage like they were Deep Throat.
Right. That was
Totally didn't happen. I'm sure they just threw that in for the sake of, making the Deep Throat reference,
right. Yeah. It was just,
It's
it's a
totally
fun
preposterous. I
movie.
mean, these two cars pull up you know, it's like
And to get Julie,
to get Julie on the phone. Yeah. That didn't happen. Well, did you notice later on, Nixon says to Chapin, "What are you, an effing potted plant?" I
yeah,
mean, that's obviously a reference to Ollie North
I
during.
know they're getting a little ahead of themselves
Yeah, I
there.
know, I know.
My God. I also think finally on the history that I think they overplayed just how big Elvis was by 1970.
Yeah,
Now, he was definitely a huge star in some segments, mainly the working class
right.
of America. But I just think they exaggerated a little bit that he was still this head turning star where women everywhere would just leap up and scream like Beatlemania or something. I'm sure that happened in some segments of our society, but I think his appeal was a little more limited by then.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably unlikely that Julie Nixon, who was in college in 1970, would have been an Elvis Presley fan
Right.
enough to like force her father to have the meeting that he didn't want to have.
And to get the
Um,
autograph and
and
all
to get the
that.
autograph and the picture, not mentioned in this film, that which we saw in the clip that in the National Archives thing. They really did establish a bond, and they called each other when they were in the hospital. I mean, Elvis called Nixon when he had phlebitis, and Nixon called Elvis when he was hospitalized. So they met and kind of got along, and that's true in the movie. And there's no reason for them to point out that they continued to be friends, but are
But,
friendly or whatever it is that famous people are when they talk to each other. But
but Nixon was really like that. And I remember an anecdote that Richard Carpenter told. The Carpenters came and performed at the Nixon White House, did
yeah,
a set of songs, and Nixon always kept in touch with them after he left office. And when Karen died, very misty eyed Richard did an interview saying, of all of the famous people that we met and that we interacted with and big politicians, Richard Nixon was the only one that wrote me a personal note after
yeah,
Karen died. So
uh,
Nixon was like that, as our
yeah,
friend Ken Kachigan has confirmed,
yeah.
to us. Yeah.
All right, let's talk about our favorite scenes.
All right. Well, if you don't like the main meeting scene
Yeah,
of
right,
this movie's not going to do much for you
right.
because that was the money scene, and I really liked the way that it was very awkward at first, and then they both loosened up, and then by the end they were sort of bonding. I thought the meeting and the scene rolled out in a very nice way.
Yeah. I like, obviously that's the highlight of the movie. I'm going to call out the very beginning. Just before Nixon lets him into the Oval Office, he says Elvis is weak and that people like him crumble easily. But as soon as Elvis enters the office, he controls the meeting by not sitting where he's supposed to sit. He eats the president's M&Ms. He drinks the diet, the Dr. Pepper. He's telling Nixon that he's a good-looking guy. I mean, he's negotiating hard and refusing the photo until he's promised the badge, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And Jim, this reminded me, you've mentioned a lot of times that when CEOs, before they go into a meeting with the president, they talk tough, but then they wilt when they're talking to the president. But in this case, it's Elvis who doesn't wilt.
Yeah,
And
it's the
why
other way
should he? Because he
around.
used, yeah, why should he? He's used to getting his way.
Yeah. No,
I
he
thought that was
was,
very clever in the beginning where, Elvis, immediately puts Nixon off guard by not doing what he's supposed to do.
yeah, he was very skillful in the meeting. And maybe if he were still alive, maybe he'd be part of the new cabinet that's being formed today. Enough
Yeah.
said.
Put him in charge. And maybe put him in charge of the DEA. Yeah. I related to that. I kind of liked the scene where Crow was briefing Elvis on Oval Office protocol, and Elvis's guys were briefing Dwight Chapin on Elvis's behavior. And this quick cutting between these two meetings, enabled us to see who was supposed to do what, and it prefigured what was going to happen in the meeting because as soon as it's very clever because as soon as Elvis like eats those M&Ms, you go, whoa, he's eating the
Yeah.
M&Ms.
And folks, that stuff really happens
Yeah,
in meetings between big shots with their staff. And oftentimes the staff makes a bigger deal of these little habits and peculiarities
right.
than the principals do.
Yeah, yeah,
But it's their job, I guess.
I guess.
I like the airport check-in scene
Yeah,
just because it was funny. It was just funny in it. And I liked how it culminated ultimately in Elvis getting what he wants, which I guess is to take his guns on board. Because by giving photograph, having his picture taken with the kids of the airport officials.
well, yeah, yes, it was very clever. This is Jerry Schilling who came up with that. Elvis calls him from the sheriff's or from the whatever the TSA was called back then, and he's like, "What am I going to do to get out of this mess?" And he says, "Yeah, call your. Does the guy have any daughters?" So they bring him in.
Right.
Yeah, but then he uses the same technique with Julie Nixon. So
Right.
it was foreshadowing.
Tied together. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I like the scene. I know you didn't you think you maybe thought this was padding, but I like the scene in the donut shop where all the patrons are black and Elvis is cool enough to talk to them without condescending to them. He's
Yeah.
all making jokes but he's also making sure everyone knows he has a gun without threatening them. So
Right. Yeah. It was good. Yeah.
well,
I like
and it's bizarre even that kind of happened. Elvis just walks into a donut shop.
I like the scene where near the beginning where Elvis is watching his multiple TV screens.
Yeah,
And I liked it for a couple of reasons. First, it had Dr. Strangelove
right,
on there, and I thought, oh, that has to be BS. But then we hear from the real Jerry Schilling that Elvis loved Dr. Strangelove
right,
in the movie, which is pretty relatively deep movie
right,
for
right.
for Elvis to like, I thought, and my stereotype of him was. And then, but I also like the fact that it, through fleeting images of real life, it showed sort of the paranoia and the disturbances of that time.
Yeah,
And, right into my own household, my mother had a lot of paranoia about would her beloved son get into drugs? There was a lot of paranoia and fear going on around that time and frustration. And I thought just with those images and then with Elvis throwing something at one of the TV screens, which, probably didn't happen, but
I thought he shot. Didn't he shoot it?
yeah, he shot it.
Yeah, I think that
Um,
actually did happen. In the
yeah,
back of my mind, I'm thinking, I think there was a time when Elvis
yeah.
shot out TV.
But anyway, I like that as a good setup for what was to come.
Yeah. So this is where we talk about our favorite lines, and I actually have probably too many. This is,
Oh, go on with it.
some movies produce
Yeah.
barely any good lines. This
Yeah.
one has lots of them. So why don't you
Go
go?
for it. Well, you go for a couple.
All right, all right. Elvis is on the. I think it's on the plane. He says he's talking about how much he loves America. Do you think there'd be an Elvis Presley if this land was communist? You know,
Yeah,
you
that's
know.
good. Yeah.
Sonny West to Jerry Schilling after confirming that he works in Hollywood. Do you watch The Partridge Family? Lori Partridge is such a piece of ass. Next time I'm in town, can you set me up with her? I'm just going to note that Susan Day was 18 at the time. So
Luckily, she was 18.
yeah, lucky she was 18.
I like the line where Nixon in the pre-meeting um, was told that, by the staff that, we've got to, Elvis's message can be get high on life. And Nixon goes, get high on life. I like that. That's good. Like, the most, talk about a square.
I know it was it's the worst cliche of our
banal,
life. The
right.
whole,
And Nixon's acting like it's this big, profound discovery.
right.
I just thought
Like he
that
never
was
heard it
funny.
before. Yeah.
Right.
Nixon, when he's asked to squeeze the Elvis meeting into the schedule, and you think I should meet him during my nap hour?
Yeah, I know. I like when Elvis got to the White House and he's looking around. He says, kind of looks like my place.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
was
When he's getting ready for the meeting, he says, a grown-up man using hairspray. I put on all these things and I become an object, no different from a bottle of Coke.
yeah, I had that one down too. And
Okay.
that ad that got extra resonance when he was approached at the airport waiting area by Elvis impersonators.
Yeah.
And it got to the idea of what's real and what isn't real with
Right.
a figure like Elvis, because he is incredibly impersonated. I mean,
Yeah.
Elvis presides at people's weddings in Las Vegas all the time.
Well, this is something you hear from famous people all the time. No one really knows the real me, you know.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
the poor Queen of England. I mean, that was the worst for her than for anyone.
yeah. I have
Uh,
to call out a sort of a hidden gem that won't, it might not resonate to a lot of the audience, but um, Elvis and Nixon are talking, and Elvis explains that he tried to give a gift to Vice President Spiro Agnew, but Agnew said, "I'm not allowed to accept gifts,"
You're right.
which is a very,
Right.
because the
Right. I
history,
I
of
didn't
course,
catch that. You're right. Nick,
Agnew had to leave office in disgrace because he was caught accepting gifts, including envelopes of cash,
right.
stuffed into the drawer of his desk as the vice president. And so it was just a clever line to throw in there.
I think that's another one of those Easter eggs. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, all right. Nixon says, I'm not bringing some goddamn rock and roller into the Oval Office. Tell him to try again next time. Maybe he'll have more luck with a Democrat. Nixon had some of the best lines. Like after Julie Nixon convinces her father to see him, and Dwight Chapin says, "Don't blame me." Nixon says, "Doesn't matter anymore, does it? Because the leader of the free world is taking orders from a 22-year-old college girl." Elvis says, "I don't think the size of a man's house defines him." It's profound, but it was also a good sense of because Nixon was saying, he says Graceland is 10,000 square feet, and Nixon says, "Well, I think this is about 60,000 square feet." And that's when he says he doesn't think the size of a man's house defines him. And Nixon's been caught, kind of bragging about something superficial just after he's talked about how poor he is and all that kind of stuff. So
Right.
puts him
Yeah.
in his place. Oh, and finally, a line that we've called out before in this podcast, when Elvis is watching Dr. Strangelove in Graceland, the president in that movie, Peter Sellers, says, "Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room."
I know that was a great line then and in this movie.
Always.
Yeah.
What is the relevance or comparisons to politics and society today? Does this movie have any resonance still?
I think it does because maybe in contrast, but the cohabitation between political and entertainment celebrities is much more commonplace now. No one would make a movie or think there's anything particularly noteworthy about the time Paul McCartney visited Obama in the White House. Um, when celebrities would go to the White House or perform in earlier times, they were huge signifiers of what that president was all about and what image he was trying to convey. And they made a much bigger splash, and now it's so commonplace. But when, for example, in the Kennedy White House, when Pablo Casals
Yeah.
performed at the White House, that was a big deal. And within a year, they were making jokes about it on Leave It to Beaver, of all things, which hardly ever dealt with headline news kinds of stuff.
Right.
Nixon had Johnny Cash. appear and perform at the White House and talk about prison reform. Um, you also had occasions when the unexpected occurred. Eartha Kitt
Oh yeah.
upbraided LBJ when she was invited to the White House about the Vietnam War. Nixon had the Ray Conniff singers in to perform, the most white bread group you can imagine, until one of the female singers held up an anti-war sign and sort of disrupted the performance. And of course, since then, we now have had presidents who were in entertainment before they became politicians, namely Reagan and Trump. And even Obama was a best-selling author before, before he
Right.
became president. So I think the whole issue of the intersection of the entertainment industry with political industry, with celebrities in both fields, I think is always interesting and relevant to compare and contrast.
Yeah, I mean, the compare and contrast. I mean, this is exactly the point I was going to make too. When that photo was released 13 months after it happened, the world was electrified because you saw these two amazingly famous people from different worlds finally meeting. And today, it's not such a big deal. I mean, when Trump and Kanye West met, I mean, can there be two more people who are more different than each other? It was interesting for our day, but
Yeah,
um,
it's just a fleeting moment. And, I think that there's an interesting tension and envy between the two worlds,
yeah.
Washington, D.C. and Hollywood. And that's why, each aspires to be a little more like the other world. And that's why DC has been called Hollywood for ugly people.
Yeah.
And now that I think of it, Hollywood might be called DC for stupid people, especially based on recent experience. But presidents now regularly award medals of freedom to Hollywood entertainers. Entertainers are always up on Capitol Hill testifying. It's so commonplace now that the impact has, I think, become limited. And we've especially seen that in the most recent campaign, where a lot of celebrities didn't matter to a hill of beans. But I think that's the relevance. I
Yeah.
think it's just
Yeah.
interesting to see the sort of the evolution of the mixing of these two worlds, of politics and entertainment.
I have this theory, which is unrelated to politics, but that sports players want to sing,
Yeah,
singers want to act, want to be in the movies, and actors really want to be athletes.
yeah.
Famous people always want to be famous in other fields besides the ones that they're in.
And now I think with social media, you do see
Yeah,
a lot of actors want to be political analysts and
right.
commentators on the issues of the day. And that's fine to the degree. Everyone has the right to their opinions, but there's no particular reason we should listen to one
Well,
act.
I think we saw in the
Yeah.
last election that people were actually not listening. So could this movie be made today?
Only if it hadn't been made before. Um, yeah, it's timeless in a way because of the interest in Nixon and Elvis, probably more so in Elvis at this point. But there's no reason to remake it.
Well, no, I mean, right, right. And I would actually say that with every passing year, interest in Nixon is waning. So if it was going to be made, it would be with a streaming service. And I think it never would have gone to the theater in the first place. It would have just gone straight to Netflix or whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
If you were a high school teacher, would you assign this movie?
No, it's not really educational enough. It's just fun. It's
It's
just
fun,
fun.
yeah. And
Yeah,
also, there's too much swearing. I mean, you get in trouble
yeah, yeah.
showing this movie. All right.
Pre-credit, pre-credit swearing, pre-credit F-bomb by Richard Nixon. And by the way, I've listened to lots of tapes. That was not a common word at all for him.
Yeah.
You could probably count on the fingers of one hand. I think that's been way exaggerated in this movie and the Oliver Stone Nixon movie. He did use other, maybe mainly GD, used a lot, but he was not normally an F-bomb thrower.
his problem was, when they released the tapes, they put in expletive deleted every time he said goddamn or whatever.
Or Jesus
And-
Christ,
or Jesus
the
Christ,
expletive
yeah.
deleted.
And it just let our imaginations run wild about what he was saying. If they probably just released it straight, I don't know. What's the grade? What's the grade for the movie?
Oh, I give it a B plus, just for, a few extra brownie points. It's decently made. It's pretty well acted, and it's fun and it's fast and enjoyable. Good
Yeah, and that's
entertainment.
I mean, again, we're on the same page with this. I'd also give it a B plus for the same reasons. I mean, if you're looking for something to watch on a Saturday night where you don't want to watch anything heavy or long, I mean, this is the perfect movie to put on because it's
Yeah.
it's fast and fun. Any other closing words,
No.
observations? All right, so I'm just going to close as usual by saying that the podcast is available on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, and most podcast platforms. You can subscribe there, and it would be great if you did. If you have comments, you can email them to me at garyholmes76@gmail. Our next movie would be Christmas classic, Love Actually. There's a fictional U.S. president who plays an important role in this movie. I'm going to be upfront with everyone. I actively dislike this movie, but I feel that it's a Christmas tradition to hate watch holiday movies. So especially ones with presidents in them. So
Okay, Gary, I'm still going to remind you when we do the podcast that you said we would never talk about this movie on the celluloid
I
president.
know. I did say I would never watch this movie, but then as the more I thought about it, I thought, this president in this movie that I want to talk about that the way they depict him. So
All right.
we'll see that next time. All right. Goodbye, everyone.
So you think we should meet with him?
Yes, Mr. President.
During my nap hour.
Everybody loves Elvis. He could really help us with the youth folk. He would also like a badge.
A what?
I would like to go undercover as a federal agent. I've been in 31 major motion pictures. That makes me an expert in costume and disguise. I could infiltrate the communists, and then I'd bust them all. Let's do this thing.
An undercover rock and roller. Sounds ludicrous.
I can supply my own firearms.
All right, now what do we have on this guy?
Well, he's one of the most famous men on the planet. Loves guns, hates the Beatles.
The Beatles. Well, I don't like them.
Okay, sir, do you have any firearms or weapons of any kind on your person? It's a good thing they didn't catch this little fella in my boot.
Mr. Presley, we're going to have to go over the protocols. Mr. President, Mr. Elvis Presley. On the coffee table is a dish with M&Ms. Those are only for the president.
M&Ms are my favorite.
Mine too.
There is also an unopened bottle of Dr. Pepper.
You have a bottle opener?
Please do not open it. Please do not drink from it because it's only for the president.
What in the good God is going on?
I don't know, sir.
Make sure we get a picture with Mr. Presley and me. You and me, we rose from nothing, but look where I am today. Look where you are.
That's how I learned to develop these knuckles of steel. Now slap them. Come on, harder. Harder. Let it out. Let it out. Those are the steel claws of a tiger, Mr. President.